I think just about everyone who watches this channel knows what Murder Drones is. And if you don't, you can watch my videos on them. But Murder Drones wouldn't be where it is today if it wasn't for two other web animations. The more well-known of the two is Cliffside. Hazbin Hotel may have started the web animation renaissance, but a year prior, Cliffside showed everybody the potential indie animation has, and I still consider it to be one of the best web series pilots there is. I'm going to go through a detailed summary of what happens in Cliffside, so if you want to experience it in its best form, I recommend you watch it before resuming this video, and if you have seen it already, skip to the time displayed on the screen now to get to the review. The episode begins with an outlaw named Waylon who goes by 2-Bit Jerry, narrating in a town named Cliffside, which according to him is home to some of the most dastardly outlaws around. His narration is interrupted by a woman named Honest Joe, who is his supposed partner in crime. Waylon fires his gun at a monster who has made its way into the center of the town, but pitifully misses. The monster duplicates itself and begins surrounding Waylon and Joe, but as Waylon is convinced that they will have to fight until the bitter end, Joe already has killed them all. Waylon confidently takes the credit for the feat, but is interrupted when one of the monsters isn't really dead and pounces on him, and he begins begging Joe for help, saying that he learned his lesson, which is a lie that he gets punished for when another monster joins in to aid in his torment. The scene cuts to Waylon playing with pine cones next to a derailed train, when Joe reminds him that he is supposed to be on watch because of the high amount of monsters in the area. Waylon gets defensive and begins to brag about what a hardcore outlaw he is, and tries to emphasize his point by bringing out his gun, but it slips out of his hands and falls into a nearby forest. Joe tells him again to stand guard, and it doesn't take long for Waylon to leave his post to retrieve his gun. He wanders to the edge of the forest and succeeds in finding his gun, but when he reaches for it, his hand gets caught by some translucent wires. Waylon is eventually able to pull himself out of the wires, only to stumble into more wires, completely rendering him immobile. The strings lift him up into the trees, and he realizes he's been caught in a giant spider web. He begins to struggle, but he doesn't budge, and he sees out of the corner of his eye as a creature approaching him. A spider girl crawls towards him and tries to intimidate Waylon, but it turns out she is not really good at being a monster and is pretty awkward. Waylon stands his ground and begins to brag again about what a dastardly outlaw he is, and to his surprise, the spider girl believes him. He continues bragging to distract the girl when he uses his spurs to cut himself out of the web. He does just this and unceremoniously falls out of her web to the forest floor. Waylon picks himself off the ground, thinking he's escaped, but when he turns around, the girl is standing right next to him, entertained by his efforts. Before they can start a conversation, a giant pterodactyl carrying death itself on her back lands nearby. The spider girl immediately gets nervous and says hi to the pterodactyl. The pterodactyl, whose name is Yanis, threatens the spider girl, who she calls Cordy, and begins to berate her, telling her to go back to keeping watch. Waylon interrupts Yanis and stands up for Cordy, saying that she's a great hunter and can do much more than just keep watch. Yanis takes offense to this and picks up both Waylon and Cordy, flies up in the air, and drops them. Cordy is in awe of Waylon for standing up to Yanis and grabs Waylon before shooting a web that latches onto Yanis and pulls her down with them, breaking their fall and using the momentum to crash Yanis into the ground. Cordy begins gushing over how cool Waylon was when he stood up to Yanis in death itself and declares that she wants to be just like Waylon. Waylon is flattered by Cordy's praises and offers to train her to be his apprentice, and they go through a training montage ending with Waylon and Cordy in the middle of robbing a bank. Waylon gets cold feet and tells Cordy maybe they've taken things too far. The authorities along with Joe stand outside the building, ready to arrest Waylon and Cordy. Cordy is able to defeat the authorities with little difficulty, but Joe intimidates her into backing down. Waylon begins to explain everything that has happened over the last couple of days and mentions that he and Cordy were able to kill death itself. Cordy mentions that they can't really kill death itself, and Waylon takes a moment to process the ramifications of that fact. Suddenly, Death appears, still angry at Waylon and Cordy for earlier. Joe tells Waylon it's time to be responsible and learn his lesson. Waylon goes to talk to Death and tells Death that he was appointed as the sheriff in an attempt to manipulate Death into sparing him. Death takes this as a patronizing insult and begins to beat up Waylon, but Waylon mentions if the sheriff keeps people from killing each other, that would create less work for Death. Death begins to attack Waylon again, but once it thinks about it, happily takes up the job and spares Waylon. Death takes up the offer and becomes the new sheriff, with life expectancy skyrocketing, and Waylon, Cordy, and Joe celebrate at the saloon. Cordy asks Joe what happened to the previous sheriff since the position was open, and Joe says that he was shot and no one ever found the culprit. The episode ends with a dastardly grin flashing across Waylon's face. Waylon is a very entertaining lead character. His extreme bravado contrasted with his cowardly, smooth-talking demeanor makes him a character who the viewer will like, but hate just enough to enjoy seeing him get hurt, which is something that happens plenty of times to the viewer's satisfaction and to get some good laughs. It's becoming rarer and rarer for a non-adult animated series to have a protagonist who isn't just your cookie-cutter, selfless hero who would never do anything to inconvenience their friends. Waylon is not like that, and I think that's a big reason why he makes such a good main character. I'm sure if this had been a full series, his character development would have been about him being less of a coward and caring about his friends more, which although I think is an overdone arc for characters like Waylon, and I wouldn't mind if he stayed the way he is, even I know that good writing requires character development, and he has plenty of room for that. Cordy, for lack of a better term, is a very anime character. If you have ever seen Future Diary, she is kind of like a derpy Yuno. Her main shtick is that she is a monster with an inherent bloodlust that makes her slightly sadistic and psychopathic at times, but despite her being super skilled and intimidating when she wants to be, she's a ditzy derpy character that can be easily entertained or tricked. She's also obsessed with Waylon, which is played up for laughs more than anything that should be taken seriously and produces plenty of funny moments. It's evident that in the monster hierarchy, Cordy's looked down upon and kind of a social outcast, which also gives her a chance at a character arc where she proves herself to be capable and independent, and more than a ditzy character that she's introduced as. I find Cordy to be an endearing character that after all these years, still makes me quite literally laugh out loud, but I could totally see how someone could find her to be too tropey or straight up annoying. Honest Joe is basically a moody teenager rarely expressing any emotions outside of being irritated, but unexpectedly is the most responsible character in the trio. She gets the least screen time, so it's kind of hard to guess what was going to be done with her character, but at the beginning of the episode she mentions her father, so I'm sure Cliffside would have taken the Helva Boss route and made her character arc centering around her relationship with him. Waylon's childlike immaturity contrasts greatly with Joe's emotionless sassiness that instantly make them a duo who could provide entertaining dialogue no matter what situation they are in. We see next to no real interactions between Cordy and Joe, but since Cordy has that childlike obliviousness, I can only imagine like Waylon, their personalities would bounce off one another effectively. The comedy of Cliffside is mostly made up of fourth wall breaking jokes and entertaining character interactions. The fourth wall jokes fit in well since the show doesn't take itself seriously to the point where a lot of the dire situations the cast find themselves in are solved in unrealistic cartoonish ways. I don't really see this as a flaw, but knowing that characters can solve their problems through absurd solutions kills any suspense the show might have and sets that precedent for the rest of the show. Again, I don't mind it, but the lack of suspense and consequences without a doubt could be unappealing to a lot of viewers. As for the character interactions, as I already mentioned, bounce off each other exceptionally well. If the creator just made a podcast with these characters talking to each other, that would be more than enough for me. Waylon's oblivious overconfidence, Cordy's oblivious enthusiasm, and Joe's over-aware pessimism is a formula for quality, hilarious, easygoing entertainment. I don't know the correct terms for animation jargon, but Cliffside's animation I can only describe as stretchy. The characters are kind of like still drawings that bend and stretch to create an animated effect, with the only changing parts being their mouths. Like most animation, they are set in front of a still backdrop, but are done so in a way that almost makes the characters seem like they are stickers on a page. I would call the animation rudimentary, which it kind of is, but what makes it stand out is the unique blending of 3D animation that can make some scenes look very artistic and unorthodox for the better. The animation style is very hit or miss. I myself don't mind it, but I could see how it could be unsightly for others, since it doesn't look fluid or visually impressive outside of the 3D effects, which themselves can be jarring or just seem like a weird creative choice. I also have to pay some attention to the score. Unlike a certain other animated pilot, this show uses its background music to its full potential. The first time we ever meet Cordy, she is accompanied by some classic ominous sounding strings that help present her as something that should be feared. But when she slips up on her intimidating facade, the music is cut short, making the scene funnier, likely without the audience even realizing it. If you pay attention, having the background music cut off to add to the comedic effect is something that is done a lot throughout this pilot. I would almost say it's overdone, but since the music keeps itself in the background so well, it's something that you probably wouldn't notice unless you were actively trying to hear it. There's also Yanis's theme, which is a lot more jarring with it being a fast-paced EDM track in an old times West setting, but against all odds it works and made the scene all that more memorable because of how apparent it is. Last but not least is the training montage theme, which has a very self-aware harmony of vocals imitating what I would assume is the overdone harmonica in most Wild West soundtracks. Not only does it unironically sound good, but it's also hilarious in of itself from being a subtle fourth wall break. This pilot really makes the most of its score, making sure it's not only used in a way that enhances the scenes it's in without the audience noticing, but when the pilot wants you to notice the score, it's done so in a way that makes sure the scene it's being used for leaves a lasting positive impression. Cliffside was a surprise web animation that hit every mark it was going for. The setting was unique, the characters were likable and memorable, it had exceptional music, the writing is still hilarious more often than not, and its only shortcomings was the lack of a clear plot direction, which was not too big a deal for me because I was still too invested and entertained from start to finish to notice, and the animation, which really didn't bother me, but certainly is its weakest point. And as a bonus, Cliffside is basically an ode to Gravity Falls, which at the time of its release had been over for a long enough time for the fanbase to develop a craving for a spiritual successor, and Owl House didn't come out until 2 years later. If Cliffside had become a fully supported show back in 2018, it would have been a guaranteed hit since there was nothing else quite like it at the time, and the entire Gravity Falls fanbase alone would have given it more than enough support to make it a success. Unfortunately, none of that happened. Cliffside never got the recognition it deserved, but in all fairness, it had no marketing that I can find. And that's possibly because this was simply a university project. It was just a project that was made as a testament to the creator's skills, and speaking of which, at this point you might be wondering how this show relates in any way to Murder Drones. Well, the creator is none other than Liam Vickers, who is the same person who made Murder Drones. Supposedly, Liam did pitch this project around to be made into a full series, but no one would support it. This is ironic since this pilot got enough attention to probably make more than enough money to fund it for at least a couple more episodes if he had put it on Patreon, but Liam did specifically say that if he had done that, it still wouldn't have been enough just because of how ambitious the show would have been, and it would have taken his attention away from his dream job that he had at the time. To put it in perspective, it took him over a year and a half just to make this pilot that isn't even 12 minutes long. As of now, the project is currently shelved, and the likelihood of it continuing is dubious at best. There is always a possibility of it becoming a webcomic or made into a form of literature, but Liam has not hinted at either of those things, so those possibilities are merely a fan's desperate hopes that something will become of it. Cliffside was not completely a waste of time though, since it gained Liam enough attention to have a large enough following, which followed him onto his next project, and that attention is more than likely the reason that Glitch Productions hired him to make Murder Drones in the first place. It really is a tragedy that Cliffside wasn't made into a full series. If you just take a moment to compare this 12-minute web animation to the majority of animated series that came out back in 2018, it's not hard to realize that this is far more interesting, funny, and special than most of its contenders, with there only being a handful of shows that came out in that year to challenge it. It just goes to show how tone-deaf animation companies are if Liam really did pitch this series and no one greenlit it. It could have, and most likely would have, been a phenomenon. It could have raised the bar for animated series to come, which could have put the mainstream animation industry in a far better place than it is now. Who knows, maybe one day Cliffside will be resurrected, but for now, we just have to be appreciative that it ever was made at all, and that today it is one of the most salient steps Liam Vickers took in order to get him to where he is today, and hopefully create a promising future where he can continue making unique and remarkable animations like this one.
Hey yo, what the